You think you can just walk around here like you own the place? The words cut through the humid air of Dragon's Den Martial Arts Academy. Marcus Chen, third-degree black belt and rising star of the competitive circuit, stood over a thin man in janitor coveralls. The sweeper had accidentally brushed against Marcus's gym bag while mopping near the lockers. "I'm sorry, sir. Just doing my job." The janitor's voice was quiet, steady. Marcus sneered. "Your job is to clean up messes, not make them." The entire gym fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the confrontation. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others pulled out phones. Stick till the end. At 80%, there's a reveal you won't see coming. The janitor was David Santos. 53 years old, gray at the temples, calloused hands from 30 years of honest work. He'd been cleaning the Dragon's Den for 6 months now. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Always polite, always invisible, until tonight. Marcus kicked his designer gym bag closer to David's mop bucket. "Since you like touching other people's stuff, clean this too." David looked down at the expensive leather bag, then back up at Marcus. Something flickered in his dark eyes. "Just for a second." "Of course, sir." Marcus turned to his training partner Jake, loud enough for everyone to hear. "These people think they can just—" Marcus. Sensei Williams emerged from his office. The dojo owner was 67, built like an oak tree. His voice carried decades of authority. "Is there a problem?" "No problem, Sensei. Just explaining boundaries to the help." David continued mopping. His movements were methodical, efficient. The way he held the mop, the precise angles of his wrists, if anyone had been watching closely. They might have noticed something unusual, but no one was watching the janitor anymore. Marcus grabbed his water bottle and took a long drink. "Jake, let's work on those combinations we discussed. I want to be ready for the tournament next month." "The regional championship?" Jake asked. "Obviously. I'm going to destroy the competition." David's mop paused for just a moment, then resumed its steady rhythm. The evening training session began. Marcus dominated every sparring match. His kicks were sharp, his timing perfect. Students lined up to work with him, hoping some skill would rub off. David worked around the edges of the main floor. He'd developed a system over the months. Clean the locker room first, then the equipment area. Save the main training floor for last when most students were winding down. "Hey, janitor." Marcus's voice cut across the dojo. "You missed a spot." David looked up from organizing the protective gear. Marcus pointed to a small puddle of sweat near the heavy bag. "Right away, sir." As David approached with his mop, Marcus deliberately kicked his foot out. David sidestepped smoothly, avoiding the trip attempt without seeming to notice it. "Careful there." Marcus smirked. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." "Thank you for the concern." Jake frowned. "Marcus, come on, man." "What?" "I'm being helpful." Marcus's eyes never left David. "This is a martial arts school. Precision matters. Attention to detail." He stepped closer to David. "Some people understand that, others—" David finished cleaning the spot. When he straightened up, he was less than 3 feet from Marcus. For a moment, the two men looked at each other. Marcus saw what he expected to see. A tired old man in a janitor's uniform. Someone beneath notice. David saw something different in Marcus. Potential wrapped in arrogance. Skill poisoned by ego. He'd seen it before many times. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Marcus waved him away dismissively. "Just stay out of our way." David nodded and returned to his work. But Sensei Williams was watching now. The older man's weathered face showed concern. The training session continued. Marcus worked through his forms with mechanical perfection. Every technique was textbook correct. Every movement demonstrated hours of dedicated practice. But David noticed things others missed. The slight telegraph in Marcus's left hook. The way his weight shifted before his roundhouse kicks. The tiny gap in his guard when he transitioned between stances. 27 years of teaching had given David an eye for these details. "Looking good, Marcus," called one of the younger students. "You're going to kill it at regionals. That's the plan." Marcus executed a flawless jumping sidekick. The impact against the heavy bag echoed through the dojo. 3 years of training here, and I've never lost a tournament match." "Never?" Jake asked. "Not once. This place has taught me everything I need to know." David's hand tightened slightly on his mop handle. "Everything you need to know." The word stung, but not for the reason Marcus would have guessed. Sensei Williams clapped his hands. That's enough for tonight. Everyone cool down and clean up. Students began removing their protective gear and rolling up mats. The energy in the room shifted from focused intensity to casual conversation. Marcus toweled off his face and walked toward the locker room. As he passed David, he stopped. Hey, janitor, make sure you get all the sweat stains tonight. I don't want to train in a dirty gym. I understand, sir. Good. Marcus leaned closer. Because if you can't handle a simple cleaning job, maybe you should find work somewhere else. David met his gaze steadily. I take pride in my work, sir. Every aspect of it. Something in David's tone made Marcus pause. There was no deference there. No submission. Just calm certainty. What did you say? I said I take pride in my work. Marcus's jaw tightened. Your work is mopping floors. Among other things. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus felt a flicker of something he couldn't identify. Irritation? Curiosity? What other things? David shrugged. Whatever needs doing. Jake appeared beside them, holding his gear bag. Hey Marcus, you ready to go grab dinner? Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on David's face. Yeah, let's go. As the two young men walked toward the exit, Marcus glanced back once. David was already back to work, methodically cleaning the training mats. But something felt different now. Sensei Williams approached David after the last student had left. The dojo was quiet except for the sound of David's work. David. A word. David looked up from sanitizing the equipment. Yes, sir. Marcus was out of line tonight. It's not a problem, Sensei Williams. The older man studied David's face. You've been cleaning here for 6 months. Not once have you complained or caused trouble. But tonight was no different, wasn't it? Sensei Williams pulled up a chair. You handled Marcus's provocation with remarkable composure. David continued his work. I've had practice dealing with difficult people. I'm sure you have. But there was something else. The way you moved. The way you positioned yourself. That sidestep when he tried to trip you, that wasn't luck. David's hand stilled for a moment. I'm just careful, sir. Are you? Sensei Williams leaned forward. David, I've been teaching martial arts for 40 years. I can spot training from a mile away. Your posture, your balance, your spatial awareness. These aren't the habits of someone who just mops floors. The two men looked at each other across the empty dojo. I mop floors, David said quietly. That's what you hired me to do. Yes, that's what I hired you to do. Sensei Williams stood up slowly. But it's not all you've done, is it? David resumed cleaning the equipment. Good night, Sensei Williams. The dojo owner watched him for a long moment. Then he walked to his office, leaving David alone with his thoughts and his work. David finished cleaning in silence. But as he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. The weight of different uniforms. The sound of students calling him by a different title. The feeling of passing on knowledge, technique, wisdom earned through decades of discipline. He pushed the memories down. That life was behind him now, but tonight something had awakened. Marcus's arrogance had struck a nerve that David thought he'd buried. The young man's dismissive attitude toward the help revealed a character flaw that transcended martial arts, and David knew something that Marcus didn't know yet. Character flaws in a fighter were like cracks in armor. Under pressure, they always showed. As David locked up the dojo and walked to his old Honda Civic, he found himself thinking about the upcoming tournament. Marcus had mentioned regionals. 3 weeks away. David knew that tournament well. He'd competed in it 17 times, he'd won it 12, but that was a long time ago. Different life, different name on the roster. Now he was just the janitor, the invisible man who cleaned up other people's messes. David drove home through the quiet streets, his mind churning. In his small apartment, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared at a photograph on the wall. The photo showed a younger man in a pristine white G, holding a golden trophy. Behind him stood a banner. National Karate Championships, Grand Champion. The younger man looked like David. Same eyes. Same quiet intensity. But the nameplate beneath the photo read something different. Something Marcus Chen had never bothered to learn. David finished his tea and went to bed. Tomorrow was Thursday. Another cleaning day at the Dragon's Den. And Marcus would be there training for his big tournament. Confident in his superiority. Certain of his place in the hierarchy. David closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But part of him was already wondering how long he could stay invisible. and what would happen when he couldn't. The next morning, David woke before dawn out of habit. 30 years of early shifts had programmed his internal clock. He made coffee and sat by his window, watching the sun rise over the city. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter Elena, who lived across the country. "Dad, how's the new job going? Still happy with the change?" David stared at the message for a long time before responding. "It's fine, Mia. Quiet work. You sure you don't miss teaching?" David set the phone down without answering. Elena meant well, but she didn't understand. Some decisions couldn't be undone. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. He'd made his choice 3 years ago when he'd walked away from competitive martial arts. Personal reasons, family obligations, a promise to himself to find a simpler life. The cleaning job at Dragon's Den was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay the bills while he figured out what came next. But weeks had turned into months. And the familiar rhythm of the dojo, the sounds of training, the sight of students learning and growing, had become both comfort and torture. David showered and dressed for his day job. Construction cleanup at a downtown office building. Physical work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But as he drove to work, he found himself thinking about Marcus's technique. The young man was skilled, no doubt. But skill without wisdom was dangerous. Technique without character was empty. David had learned that lesson the hard way, many years ago. At the construction site, David worked alongside Miguel, a crew chief who'd become a friend over the past months. "You're quiet today, hermano," Miguel said as they cleared debris from the 3rd floor. "Something on your mind?" "Work stuff," Miguel laughed. "This work? What's to think about? We clean up, we go home, we get paid. Different work." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "The night job? The gym?" David nodded. "Trouble with the muscle heads. Something like that." Miguel set down his broom and looked at David seriously. "Listen, I've known you 6 months. You're not a guy who looks for trouble, but you're also not a guy who runs from it." He paused. "Whatever's going on, just remember, sometimes people need to learn lessons, and sometimes we're the ones who have to teach them." David met his friend's eyes. "What if teaching the lesson means revealing things you'd rather keep hidden? Then you decide what's more important, your privacy or your principles." They worked in comfortable silence after that, but Miguel's words stayed with David throughout the day. That evening, David arrived at Dragon's Den 30 minutes early, as always. Sensei Williams was in his office reviewing tournament paperwork. "Evening, David." "Evening, sir." David began his routine, starting with the locker room, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation. Students began arriving for evening practice. David heard familiar voices, familiar footsteps, the rhythm of people preparing for training, and then Marcus's voice, louder than the rest. "Did you see the bracket for regionals? I'm in the advanced division, obviously. Should be easy money." David's hand tightened on his mop handle. Easy money. As if the other competitors were just obstacles to be brushed aside. "Who else has entered?" Jake asked. "Bunch of no-names from other schools. A few guys I've beaten before. Nothing I can't handle." David emerged from the locker room and began cleaning the equipment area. He was close enough now to see Marcus and Jake examining the tournament bracket on Jake's phone. "Look at this guy," Marcus said, pointing at the screen. "David Martinez from Phoenix Dojo. Never heard of him. Probably some old-timer trying to relive his glory days." David froze. Martinez, his mother's maiden name. The name he'd competed under for 15 years before taking his father's surname of Santos. David Martinez was entered in the regional tournament, but that was impossible. David hadn't competed in 3 years, hadn't even considered it. Unless, David's eyes found Sensei Williams, who was now standing in the doorway of his office, watching the conversation with interest. Their eyes met across the dojo, and David understood. Sensei Williams had entered him in the tournament. Without permission, without consultation, the older man's expression was calm but determined. A teacher who had recognized potential and refused to let it go to waste. David felt a mix of emotions. Anger at the presumption, fear of exposure, and underneath it all, something he hadn't felt in years. Marcus was still studying the bracket, oblivious to the drama playing out behind him. "David Martinez," he repeated mockingly. "Sounds like a janitor's name." Jake looked uncomfortable. "Marcus, come on." What? I'm just saying. Probably some weekend warrior who thinks he can compete with real fighters. David set down his mop and walked quietly to the storage closet. Inside, behind boxes of cleaning supplies, was a small gym bag he'd brought months ago and never opened. Inside the bag was a folded white GI, still crisp despite years of storage, still carrying the faint scent of victory and defeat. Triumph and heartbreak. David touched the fabric gently, remembering. Then he closed the bag and returned to his work. Marcus was warming up now, running through basic forms with mechanical precision. His technique was flawless on the surface, but David's trained eye caught subtle flaws. Timing issues, balance problems, gaps in strategy, fixable problems. But only if the student was willing to listen, and Marcus clearly wasn't interested in listening to anyone. Especially not a janitor. David Martinez won't know what hit him, Marcus said as he executed a series of high kicks. I'm going to embarrass every fighter in that bracket. David continued cleaning, but his mind was racing. 3 weeks until the tournament. 21 days to decide whether to compete as David Martinez one more time. 21 days to determine whether some lessons were worth teaching, regardless of the cost. As the evening training session progressed, David found himself studying not just Marcus but all the students. Their techniques, their attitudes, their understanding of what martial arts truly meant. Most were good kids, respectful, dedicated. They trained hard and supported each other. But Marcus was different. His skill was undeniable, but his character was flawed. And in David's experience, character flaws in a martial artist eventually led to consequences. For the fighter, and for everyone around them. The question was, what responsibility did David have to prevent those consequences? And what price was he willing to pay to fulfill that responsibility? As the evening wound down and students began leaving, David found himself alone with Sensei Williams again. The tournament entry, David said quietly. Why? Sensei Williams was putting away training equipment. Because sometimes the right teacher appears at the right moment, even if he's disguised as a janitor. I didn't ask to teach anyone anything. No, but that doesn't mean the lesson isn't needed. David looked out at the empty training floor. He's not ready for that lesson. Are any of us ever ready for the lessons that matter most? The two men worked in silence for several minutes. Finally, David spoke again. If I were to compete, yes, it would change everything. My anonymity, my peace. Yes, it would. David nodded slowly. I need time to think. The registration deadline is in 5 days. David looked at Sensei Williams with new understanding. You've been planning this. I've been hoping for this. There's a difference. As David finished his work and prepared to leave, he found himself looking at the dojo with different eyes. This wasn't just a place where he mopped floors and emptied trash cans. It was a place where character was tested. Where young people learned not just how to fight, but how to carry themselves in the world. And sometimes when arrogance grew unchecked, it was a place where humility had to be taught, whether the student wanted to learn or not. David drove home through the quiet streets, his decision still unmade but his path becoming clearer. In 3 weeks, Marcus Chen would step into a tournament ring, confident in his superiority and contemptuous of his competition, and if David chose to be there, the young man would learn that some janitors clean up more than just messes. They clean up attitudes. But first, David had to decide if he was ready to stop being invisible and whether the cost of that decision was worth the lesson that needed to be taught. 5 days passed. David said nothing about the tournament entry, but his nights were restless, filled with dreams of competitions past and decisions that couldn't be undone. On Tuesday evening, he arrived at Dragon's Den to find chaos. Marcus was in the center of the training floor, shouting at a teenage student named Tommy. The boy was maybe 16, small for his age, with thick glasses and trembling hands. Are you even trying? Marcus's voice echoed off the walls. My grandmother could block better than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. Tommy's face burned red. Several other students watched in uncomfortable silence. Sensei Williams was nowhere to be seen. David began his cleaning routine, but his attention stayed on the confrontation. Marcus was demonstrating a blocking technique with excessive force, making Tommy wince with each impact. This is basic stuff. Marcus grabbed Tommy's arm and positioned it roughly. Yellow belts should know this by heart. I'm sorry, Tommy whispered. I'm trying. Trying isn't good enough. Either you can do it or you can't. David's mop handle creaked under his grip. Jake appeared beside Marcus. Hey man, maybe ease up a little. Ease up? Marcus spun toward his training partner. The tournament is in 2 weeks. I need to sharpen my skills against real resistance, not this pathetic. Excuse me. The quiet voice cut through Marcus's rant. Everyone turned. David stood at the edge of the training floor, still holding his mop. What? Marcus's tone was pure irritation. The young man is trying his best. Perhaps a different approach would be more effective. The dojo fell silent. Students exchanged glances. No one spoke to Marcus like that, especially not the janitor. Marcus took 3 slow steps toward David. Did I ask for your opinion? No, sir. But I couldn't help noticing. You couldn't help noticing what? You think you know something about martial arts? David looked past Marcus to Tommy, who was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. I know something about teaching. Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. Teaching? You're a janitor. Yes, sir. I am. Then stick to cleaning toilets and leave the martial arts to people who actually understand them. David nodded slowly. Of course, my apologies. He returned to his work, but the damage was done. Marcus's true nature was now on full display for everyone to see. Jake helped Tommy off the training floor. The boy's confidence was shattered, his enthusiasm crushed, and David made a decision. That night, after everyone had left, David sat in Sensei Williams' office. The tournament registration form lay on the desk between them. He hurt that boy, David said quietly. Yes, he did. Not physically, but sometimes the other kind of hurt lasts longer. Sensei Williams leaned back in his chair. Marcus has always been intense. But tonight he showed his true character. David picked up a pen. Some lessons can't be taught with words. He signed the registration form. David Martinez was officially entered in the regional tournament. There's something else, Sensei Williams said. The local newspaper wants to do a feature on our school's prospects for the tournament. They're coming Thursday to interview Marcus. David set down the pen. Will they be here during training? Yes, why? No reason. Just curious about the timing. But David was thinking about more than timing. He was thinking about pride and how it always came before the fall. The next evening, Marcus arrived early for training. He'd been talking about the newspaper interview all week, telling anyone who would listen about his upcoming moment in the spotlight. David was cleaning the equipment room when he overheard Marcus on the phone. Yeah, it's going to be a great piece. Local martial arts champion prepares for regional domination. They want action shots, quotes, the whole thing. David continued organizing protective gear, but his ears stayed tuned to Marcus's conversation. I'm thinking I'll demonstrate some advanced techniques, maybe break a few boards, show them what real martial arts looks like. The line that caught David's attention came next. Of course I'll mention the school. Dragon's Den has been crucial to my development. Sensei Williams is a good teacher, but honestly, I've outgrown what he can offer. This tournament is just the first step toward bigger things. David's hand stilled on a stack of chest protectors. Marcus continued. Between you and me, most of the students here are pretty weak. I've been carrying the reputation of this place for months. After I win regionals, I'm probably going to look for a more competitive training environment. David had heard enough. He finished his work in silence, but his mind was churning. Marcus wasn't just arrogant. He was ungrateful. Ready to abandon the school that had developed his skills the moment it suited his ambitions. Some lessons, David reflected, couldn't wait for tournaments. Thursday evening arrived with unusual energy. The newspaper reporter, a woman named Sarah Chen, arrived with a photographer just as training was beginning. Marcus had dressed in his most pristine GI and spent extra time warming up, making sure every movement looked perfect for potential photos. David worked in the background, nearly invisible as always. But tonight he was watching everything with new intensity. So Marcus, Sarah Chen said, notepad ready. Tell me about your preparation for the regional tournament. It's been intense, Marcus replied, executing a series of precise kicks for the photographer. I've been training 6 days a week, focusing on advanced techniques that most competitors won't expect. What makes you confident about your chances? Marcus smiled. Honestly, the competition isn't that strong this year. I've studied the brackets, and there's nobody there who should give me real trouble. Sarah scribbled notes. Any particular opponents you're watching? Not really. There are a few older guys trying to relive their glory days, but experience only takes you so far. This is a young man's sport. David, mopping near the interview area, caught every word. The photographer wanted action shots, so Marcus began demonstrating techniques. His movements were sharp and precise, clearly the result of dedicated training. But David noticed things the camera missed. The slight tremor in Marcus's hands when he thought no one was looking. The way his breathing quickened under pressure. The tiny hesitations before complex combinations, signs of a fighter who looked perfect in practice but had never been truly tested. Tell me about Dragon's Den, Sarah continued. How has training here shaped your development? Marcus glanced around the dojo, his gaze sweeping past David without acknowledgement. This place has been adequate for developing basic skills. Sensei Williams knows the fundamentals, but to reach the next level, you need to push beyond what any single school can offer. Sensei Williams, who had been listening from across the room, showed no reaction. But David saw the slight tightening around his eyes. Are you planning to continue training here after the tournament? We'll see. Success opens up new opportunities. I'm keeping my options open. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Marcus spoke about his training philosophy, his goals, his certainty that victory was inevitable. Not once did he mention his training partners. Not once did he acknowledge the support of his fellow students. And not once did he show even basic respect for the sport's traditions of humility and respect. After the reporter left, training resumed. But the dynamic had shifted. Marcus's words had been heard by everyone, and the other students were processing what they meant. Jake was the first to speak up. So you're really thinking about leaving after the tournament? Marcus shrugged while adjusting his belt. Like I told the reporter, success creates opportunities. I can't let sentimentality hold back my development. Sentimentality? This from Sarah, a brown belt who'd been training at Dragon's Den for 4 years. This place isn't sentimentality. It's home. Home is where you get the best training. I've outgrown what this place can offer. Tommy, the young student Marcus had humiliated earlier in the week, was sitting on the side of the training floor. His voice was barely audible. If you've outgrown it, why are you still here? Marcus turned toward the boy, irritation flashing in his eyes. What did you say? Tommy's voice was stronger now. I asked why you're still here if you've outgrown us. Because I honor my commitments. Unlike some people, I finish what I start. But David heard something else in Marcus's tone. Uncertainty, fear, maybe. The young man was trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. Training resumed, but the atmosphere was tense. Marcus worked with mechanical intensity, as if trying to prove his superiority through sheer physical effort. David finished his cleaning early and was preparing to leave when Sensei Williams approached. Walk with me, the older man said. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the last students. You heard the interview, Sensei Williams said. I did. What did you think? David considered his words carefully. I think Marcus has forgotten something important. What's that? Martial arts isn't about defeating others. It's about defeating yourself. Your ego, your limitations, your fear, Sensei Williams nodded. And Marcus? Marcus is fighting everyone except the person who needs defeating most. They walked in silence for a moment. The tournament is in 10 days, Sensei Williams said finally. I know. Are you ready? David stopped walking and looked back at the dojo. Through the windows, he could see Marcus still training, still pushing himself through repetitions of the same techniques. The question isn't whether I'm ready. The question is whether he is. Ready for what? David met Sensei Williams' eyes, ready to learn that some lessons can only be taught by losing. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus's training intensified to obsessive levels. He arrived early, stayed late, and pushed himself through grueling sessions that left other students exhausted just watching. But David noticed something else. The harder Marcus trained, the more uptight he became. The more he focused on winning, the more he seemed to lose sight of why he'd started training in the first place. On the final Thursday before the tournament, David was cleaning the locker room when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. Marcus was talking to Jake by the lockers, unaware that David was working nearby. "I need to win this tournament," Marcus said, his voice tight with stress. "Not just win, dominate. Why? You're already a great fighter." "Great isn't enough anymore." Marcus sat down heavily on the bench. "You want to know the truth? I've been getting offers from other schools. Real schools. Professional training facilities." Jake looked confused. "Isn't that good?" "They're conditional. Win the regionals and the offers become real. Lose." Marcus's voice trailed off. "Lose and what?" "Lose and I'm just another black belt at a neighborhood dojo." David continued his work, but his mind was racing. Marcus wasn't just fighting for personal glory. He was fighting for his future. The pressure he was putting on himself explained the intensity, the desperation, the need to tear down everyone around him. Fear made people cruel. And Marcus was very afraid. "What about the old guy?" Jake asked. "David Martinez. You still think he's a pushover?" Marcus's laugh was forced. "Please, I looked him up online. No recent competition history. No major wins. Probably hasn't fought seriously in years." David's hand tightened on his cleaning supplies. "Age and experience only matter if you can still perform. Father Time is undefeated, you know? Maybe. But sometimes experience trumps youth. Not in my division." Marcus stood up and started changing clothes. "I've been studying video of every fighter in the bracket. I know their patterns, their weaknesses, their favorite techniques. Every fighter that matters." David finished cleaning the locker room and moved to the main training floor. But Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Every fighter that matters. The young man had no idea what he was walking into. That evening, as David prepared to leave, Sensei Williams handed him a small package. "What's this?" "Your tournament registration materials. Weigh-ins are tomorrow at 4 p.m. Competition starts Saturday at 9 a.m. David looked down at the packet. Inside was his competitor number, division bracket, and a schedule of matches. He was in the same division as Marcus, same bracket. If they both won their preliminary matches, they would face each other in the semifinals. "You knew," David said quietly. "I hoped." David studied the bracket more carefully. Marcus was seeded first, based on his recent competition record. David was unseeded, listed simply as D. Martinez, Phoenix Dojo, no ranking. No recent results. No reason for anyone to take him seriously. Perfect. "There's something else," Sensei Williams said. "Marcus has been telling people he's going to win by technical knockout in every match. He wants to make a statement." "What kind of statement?" "The kind that gets him noticed by scouts from professional training camps." David nodded slowly. "Win at any cost." "That's what I'm afraid of." David tucked the registration packet into his jacket. "Don't worry, Sensei. Some costs are higher than others." As David drove home that night, he found himself thinking about Tommy, the young student Marcus had humiliated, about Sarah and Jake and all the other students whose dedication Marcus had dismissed, about Sensei Williams, who had given Marcus years of patient instruction only to be repaid with ingratitude and arrogance, and about every young fighter who would face Marcus. In the future, if someone didn't teach him that talent without character was a dangerous weapon, tomorrow, the lessons would begin. But tonight, David had one more thing to do. In his apartment, he opened the closet and pulled out his old competition gear. The white gi was still pristine, still carried the faint scent of victory and defeat. But it was the belt that made him pause. Black silk, worn smooth by decades of use. At one end, embroidered in gold thread, were the characters that spelled his name. At the other end, barely visible now, were small gold stars, one for each major tournament victory. David counted them slowly. 12 stars. 12 regional championships. 4 national titles. 1 international bronze medal. 27 years of competition. 15 years as an instructor. And 3 years of hiding. David folded the belt carefully and placed it in his gear bag. Tomorrow, Marcus would learn that some janitors had cleaned up more than floors. They had cleaned up competition brackets. But first, Marcus would learn what it felt like to face someone who understood that winning and domination were 2 very different things, and that sometimes the most important victory was teaching someone else how to lose with grace. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold. The Phoenix Convention Center buzzed with pre-competition energy. Fighters warmed up in corners. Coaches gave last-minute instructions. Parents clutched programs and cameras. David arrived alone. He wore a simple tracksuit over his GI, carried his gear in an old duffel bag, and moved through the crowd like a ghost. No entourage, no fanfare, just another middle-aged competitor trying to recapture past glory. Exactly what everyone expected to see. Marcus arrived with considerably more ceremony. Jake Sensei Williams and 3 other Dragon's Den students formed his support crew. His gear bag was new, expensive, branded with sponsor logos. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. David found a quiet corner and began his warm-up routine. Simple stretches, basic movements, nothing flashy or intimidating, but his eyes never stopped moving. Studying the other competitors, assessing their strengths, cataloging their tells, old habits, attention competitors. The tournament director's voice boomed through the sound system. Divisions 1 through 4 report for equipment inspection. David was in Division 3, men's advanced black belt, 35 and over. Marcus had somehow talked his way into the same division despite being only 26. Politics or arrogance? Probably both. The equipment check was routine. Gear inspection, final weigh-ins, bracket confirmation. David moved through the process efficiently, drawing no attention from officials or other competitors. But Marcus made sure everyone noticed him. First time competing, old-timer? Marcus appeared beside David at the weigh-in station. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were calculating. David stepped onto the scale. "No, sir. Really? I don't recognize you from the circuit." The scale showed 178 pounds. David stepped down without comment. Marcus stepped up next. "I'm Marcus Chen, from Dragon's Den Academy. You might have seen me in the local paper this week." "I don't read much." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "Well, good luck today. Try not to get hurt out there." David nodded politely and walked away, but he felt Marcus watching him, trying to figure out what he was missing. The opening ceremony was brief. Welcoming remarks, rule reviews, bracket announcements. David listened with half attention, his mind focused on what was coming. His first match was against Tony Reeves, a 38-year-old school teacher from Tucson. Solid fundamentals, decent conditioning, but no real surprises. Marcus's first opponent was Kevin Walsh, a 24-year-old from a Phoenix suburb. Aggressive style, limited technique, easy to bait into mistakes. Both matches were scheduled for Ring 2, back-to-back perfect. Division 3 first-round matches. Report to staging areas. David gathered his gear and made his way to Ring 2. A small crowd had gathered, mostly families and teammates of the competitors, but David noticed something interesting. Several older men in tournament official jackets had positioned themselves with clear views of the ring. Experienced eyes, evaluating talent. Marcus's scouts were already here. Tony Reeves was a good opponent. Respectful, well-trained, fighting with the quiet intensity of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to give. David liked him immediately. The referee called them to center ring. Bow to each other. Touch gloves. Good luck to both of you. The match began. David fought carefully, feeling out his opponent's timing and preferred techniques. Tony was solid, good footwork, clean combinations, defensive awareness. But David had been doing this for longer than Tony had been alive. 2 minutes into the first round, David found his opening. Tony telegraphed his left hook with a slight shoulder dip. David stepped inside the punch, swept Tony's lead leg, and controlled him to the ground with perfect technique. The submission came 30 seconds later, a gentle shoulder lock that gave Tony every opportunity to tap out before any damage occurred. Winner by submission, David Martinez. Polite applause from the small crowd. Tony helped David to his feet, bowed respectfully, and whispered, "Great match, sir," before leaving the ring. Class. Tony Reeves had class. David was toweling off when Marcus's match began. He positioned himself where he could watch without being obvious about it. Kevin Walsh was exactly what David had expected. Strong, aggressive, limited. The kind of opponent who made Marcus look good without providing real competition. Marcus dominated from the opening bell. His technique was crisp, his timing perfect, his strategy flawless. Against this level of competition. The match ended in the second round with Marcus landing a clean head kick that dropped Kevin instantly. Technical knockout. Textbook execution. The crowd approved with enthusiastic applause. Marcus raised both arms in victory, soaking up the attention. The scouts took notes. Marcus found David near the equipment area afterward. "Nice match," Marcus said, but his tone was dismissive. "That submission was clean, thank you." Of course, ground fighting is different from striking. My match was a little more dynamic. David continued packing his gear. Different opponents require different approaches. True, but real martial artists prefer to finish fights on their feet. David looked up at Marcus. "Is that what you are? A real martial artist?" Marcus's smile turned cold. "I'm the guy who's going to win this tournament." "We'll see." Something in David's tone made Marcus pause. There was no challenge in the words, no threat, just calm certainty. It bothered Marcus more than trash talk would have. The quarterfinal matches were scheduled for 2 hours later. David used the time to study video of his next opponent on a tablet. Jerry Williams, a 41-year-old former military man with excellent conditioning and a grinding, pressure-heavy style. Tough, but predictable. Marcus's quarterfinal opponent was more interesting. Alex Rodriguez, a 30-year-old with legitimate credentials and a recent win streak. The first real test of Marcus's tournament. David was watching Marcus warm up when Sensei Williams appeared beside him. "How do you feel?" the older man asked quietly. "Like I did 20 years ago." "Nervous?" David shook his head. "Grateful." "For what?" "For the reminder of why I loved this sport." Sensei Williams studied David's face. "And after today?" "After today, we'll see if Marcus learned anything." The quarterfinal matches lived up to expectations. Jerry Williams was everything David had anticipated. Tough, grinding, relentless. But predictable. David fought patiently, letting Jerry set the pace while looking for openings. The breakthrough came in the third round when Jerry's cardio began to fade and his defensive positioning suffered. David's finish was sudden and decisive. A perfectly timed throw followed by a clean choke. Jerry tapped quickly, recognizing superior technique. Winner by submission, David Martinez. Bigger applause this time. The crowd was beginning to notice that the quiet older man was quietly dismantling his competition. Marcus's match was a different story. Alex Rodriguez was everything Kevin Walsh wasn't. Technical, experienced, confident. He pressured Marcus from the opening bell, forcing the younger man to fight defensively for the first time in the tournament. Marcus adapted, but it took time. And it took effort. The match went the full 15 minutes, with Marcus winning a narrow decision based on a strong third-round rally. But David had seen something important. Marcus could be pressured, could be made uncomfortable, could be forced to fight someone else's fight. And when that happened, cracks appeared in his perfect technique. The semifinals were scheduled for late afternoon. One match would determine the division. Champion. David Martinez versus Marcus Chen. The janitor versus the star student. The Invisible Man versus the future of Dragon's Den Academy. News of the matchup spread quickly through the tournament venue. The crowd around Ring 2 grew larger, sensing that something special was building. Marcus spent the break between matches giving interviews to local media who had heard about the rising star from Dragon's Den. David spent the time sitting quietly, eyes closed, breathing slowly, preparing. "This is it," Sensei Williams said, approaching David 20 minutes before the match. "Last chance to change your mind." "About what?" "About staying invisible." David opened his eyes. Across the venue, he could see Marcus surrounded by cameras and microphones. "I stopped being invisible the moment I signed that registration form." "And after this match?" David stood and began walking toward Ring 2. "After this match, Marcus will understand something important about martial arts." "What's that?" David stopped at the edge of the competition area. The crowd was thick now, at least 200 people pressed around the ring. That the most dangerous opponents are the ones you don't see coming. The ring announcer's voice cut through the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, our Division 3 semifinal match. In the red corner, representing Dragon's Den Academy, 3-time regional qualifier Marcus Chen." Enthusiastic applause. Marcus entered the ring with practiced showmanship, bowing to each corner, raising his arms to acknowledge the crowd. And in the blue corner, representing Phoenix Dojo, David Martinez. Polite applause. David entered quietly, bowed once to the referee, and took his position. The contrast was stark, but as David settled into his fighting stance, something changed in his posture. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing deepened. His eyes focused with laser intensity. 27 years of muscle memory activated. Marcus noticed the change immediately. The older man moved differently now. Lighter, more balanced, more dangerous. For the first time all day, Marcus felt a flutter of uncertainty. "Fighters ready?" the referee asked. Both men nodded. "Touch gloves. Back to your corners." David's glove tap was firm but respectful. Marcus's was harder, trying to send a message. But David had received and sent those messages 1,000 times before. "Fight." Marcus opened aggressively as expected. A probing jab followed by a low kick, testing David's reactions and defensive positioning. David absorbed the strikes easily, moving just enough to minimize impact while studying Marcus's timing. Marcus pressed forward, throwing combinations with practiced precision. His technique was flawless, his power evident. But none of his strikes were landing cleanly. David wasn't blocking or parrying with obvious defensive movements. He was simply not there when the strikes arrived. Subtle footwork, minor adjustments in distance, tiny shifts in angle that made Marcus's attacks graze rather than connect. 30 seconds into the match, Marcus realized he was fighting someone completely different from his previous opponents. The crowd sensed it too. The energy in the venue shifted, becoming more focused, more intense. This wasn't just another tournament match. This was education. Marcus adjusted his strategy, switching to longer combinations and more varied attacks. Punches to the body followed by kicks to the head. Feints in misdirection designed to break down David's defensive rhythm. But David's rhythm never broke. Every attack was answered. Every combination was neutralized. Every attempt to control distance was frustrated. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, David began to counterattack. Not with flashy techniques or devastating power. With precision. A light jab that found gaps in Marcus's guard, a low kick that barely connected but disrupted his balance, a shoulder bump that created space at exactly the right moment. Small actions, minimal effort. Maximum effect. Marcus's frustration began to show. His combinations became more forced, his attacks more telegraphed. The smooth efficiency that had carried him through his earlier matches was replaced by increasing desperation. And that's when David's true skill became apparent. The older man wasn't just defending and countering. He was controlling the entire fight, dictating distance, managing timing, forcing Marcus to fight at a pace and rhythm that suited David's game plan. It was like watching a master chess player move pieces around the board while his opponent struggled to understand the pattern. 2 minutes into the first round, David made his statement. Marcus threw a wild overhand right, putting everything behind the punch. David stepped inside the strike, caught Marcus's extended arm, and executed a textbook hip throw that sent the younger man crashing to the mat. The crowd erupted, but David didn't follow up with ground strikes or a submission attempt. Instead, he stepped back and gestured for Marcus to return to his feet. Respect. Even in domination, David showed respect. Marcus scrambled up, his face red with embarrassment and anger. The composed technical fighter from earlier in the day was gone, replaced by someone fighting on pure emotion. Exactly what David had been waiting for. The rest of the round was systematic dismantling. Marcus pressed forward with increasing desperation, while David picked him apart with surgical precision. Nothing flashy. Nothing brutal. Just perfect technique applied at perfect moments. When the bell sounded ending the first round, Marcus was breathing hard and bleeding from a small cut over his left eye. David looked like he'd been warming up. Between rounds, Marcus sat in his corner while Jake and Sensei Williams gave frantic advice. "He's just an old man," Jake was saying. "You're faster, stronger, more technical." But Sensei Williams was quiet, studying David across the ring. The older instructor's expression was one of growing recognition and growing concern. Second round, fight. Marcus came out desperate, throwing everything he had in wild combinations designed to overwhelm David through sheer volume. It lasted exactly 30 seconds. David slipped inside a sloppy right hook, caught Marcus in a clinch, and demonstrated why 27 years of competition experience mattered more than youth and aggression. The throw was poetry in motion. Marcus left his feet, rotated through the air, and landed hard on his back with David controlling his position. But instead of finishing the fight, David did something that stunned everyone watching. He leaned down and whispered something in Marcus's ear, something only the younger man could hear. Then David stood up and stepped back again, allowing Marcus to return to his feet. Marcus rose slowly, his eyes wide with shock. Whatever David had said had shaken him to his core. The crowd was silent now, sensing that something profound was happening beyond simple competition. Marcus threw 2 more half-hearted attacks, but his heart was no longer in the fight. David deflected them easily and responded with a light combination that dropped Marcus to 1 knee. The referee began the standing 8 count. At the count of 7, Marcus looked up at David. Their eyes met across the ring and Marcus nodded slightly. Submission. Not physical, but spiritual. The referee stopped the fight. Winner by technical knockout, David Martinez. The crowd exploded in applause, but David barely acknowledged it. Instead, he immediately moved to Marcus, helping the younger man to his feet and embracing him respectfully. "What did you say to him?" Jake asked later as Marcus sat in stunned silence. David was packing his gear, preparing to leave as quietly as he'd arrived. "I told him something he needed to hear." "Which was?" David looked at Marcus, who was staring at the floor with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. "I told him that I was the janitor at his dojo, and that respect isn't about who you can beat. It's about who you choose to lift up." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked up slowly, his eyes meeting David's across the staging area. You're the janitor?" "Yes. But you just—" Marcus's voice trailed off as the implications sank in. "I just what?" Marcus struggled to find words. "You just destroyed me completely. I never landed a clean shot." "No, you didn't. But you clean floors?" David smiled sadly. "I also taught martial arts for 15 years. Won 12 regional tournaments, 4 national championships, and competed internationally." The color drained from Marcus's face. "My name is David Santos. I competed as David Martinez. I was head instructor at Phoenix Traditional Martial Arts until 3 years ago." Marcus's hands began to shake. "You've been cleaning our dojo for 6 months." "Yes. And I treated you like a janitor, which I am." David finished packing his gear and shouldered his bag. "But that doesn't mean I was never anything else. And it doesn't mean other people deserve to be treated as less than human because of the work they do." Marcus stood up slowly. "Why? Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Would it have changed how you treated Tommy or Sarah? Or any of the other students you dismissed as beneath your notice?" Marcus had no answer. David walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back. "There's a difference between being a martial artist and being a fighter, Marcus. Fighters defeat opponents. Martial artists defeat themselves. I don't understand. Your ego. Your need to dominate others. Your contempt for people you consider inferior." David's voice was gentle but firm. "Those are the real enemies. Everything else is just practice." David started to leave again, but Marcus's voice stopped him. "Wait, please." David turned back. "I'm sorry for everything. The way I treated you, the way I treated the other students. Marcus struggled with the words. "I was wrong." "Yes, you were. Is there any way you could teach me?" "Really teach me?" David studied Marcus's face for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility and shame. "I don't know. That depends. On what?" "On whether you're ready to start over. As a white belt. With all the respect and humility that requires?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I am. Think isn't good enough. Come back to Dragon's Den next Tuesday. Not as the star student, but as someone who has a lot to learn." David started walking toward the exit again. And Marcus, "Yes, sir?" "Apologize to Tommy and mean it. Some wounds take longer to heal than others." David left the tournament venue the same way he'd arrived, quietly, without fanfare, carrying his old gear bag. But something had changed. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like a teacher again. Behind him, Marcus sat in stunned silence. Processing everything that had happened, Jake sat down beside him. "So what now?" Marcus looked at his hands, still trembling from the match and the revelation. "Now I learn what I should have been learning all along." "Which is?" Marcus managed a weak smile. "How to be worthy of the belt I wear." On Tuesday evening, David arrived at Dragon's Den for his usual cleaning shift. But tonight felt different. Marcus was already there, sitting quietly on the bench near the locker room. He wore a plain white gi with a white belt. I threw away my black belt, Marcus said quietly as David approached. David set down his cleaning supplies. Why? Because I hadn't earned it. Not really. I'd earned the techniques, but I hadn't learned what they were supposed to teach me. David nodded approvingly. Sensei William says you're the best teacher he's ever seen. He wants to know if you'd consider coming back as an instructor. And what do you want? Marcus looked up, meeting David's eyes directly. I want to learn what it means to be a martial artist instead of just a fighter. David was quiet for a long moment. It's going to be harder than anything you've done before. Real martial arts isn't about defeating others. It's about conquering yourself. I understand. Do you? Because the person you'll be fighting every day is your own ego. Your need to be special, to be superior, to dominate others. David's voice was gentle but serious. That's the hardest opponent you'll ever face. Marcus nodded. I'm ready to try. David looked around the dojo, seeing it through different eyes than he had for months. All right. But first you help me finish cleaning. Every martial artist should understand that no task is beneath them. Marcus stood up immediately. Yes, sir. As they worked side by side, the former champion and the humbled student, David reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, he'd walked away from teaching, convinced his time was over. Tonight, he was reminded that sometimes the most important lessons came disguised as endings. And sometimes, the best teachers were the ones who remembered what it felt like to be students. 6 months later, David Santos returned to his position as head instructor at Dragon's Den Academy. Marcus Chen earned his black belt again 2 years later. But this time he earned it through service, humility, and the quiet satisfaction of lifting others up instead of tearing them down. Tommy became one of the dojo's most dedicated students, eventually competing in tournaments himself with Marcus as his biggest supporter. And every Tuesday and Thursday evening, David still helped with the cleaning, not because he had to, but because he'd learned that true strength isn't about who you can defeat. It's about who you choose to serve. And that lesson, more than any technique or trophy,